So, welcome to Buddhist View podcast. I'm very happy and pleased to have Professor Mates have accepted my invitation. So, welcome, Professor.
Well, thank you for your invitation.
Yeah,
I'm happy to be here and talk to you about Mahāmudrā.
Yes, so I requested for us to have a chat on different perspectives of Mahāmudrā, especially early Mahāmudrā and up until maybe the 13th, 14th century. But let's see how far we get.
Well, it implies that you get free from perspectives. So there are no perspectives.
Excellent. So let's see how much perspective we lose. So just as to introduce Professor Mates, he is the former head of the Department of South Asian, Tibetan and Buddhist Studies at Vienna University, and since 2.5 years, an endowed professor at the Center of Buddhist Studies at Hong Kong University. Professor Mates is published in the fields of Yogācāra, Buddha nature, and Mahāmudrā. So, just to get the conversation rolling, my first question is, Professor Mates, what is Mahāmudrā and how did you encounter it?
Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction. And of course, first we have to explain what Mahāmudrā means. A literal translation would be the great seal. Yeah? And to have the seal of emptiness means to have the nature of emptiness. So the universe has the seal of emptiness. So that means everything in the universe is empty of an independent existence. There is not like a tiny small atom or solar system or whatever that would not abide by this rule of emptiness. You could compare it with like an edict by a king. So he says, everybody in my kingdom has to pay 10% tax. And then he puts his seal. So that seal means, every subject in the kingdom has to pay tax. So there is not one exemption. So in a similar way, you put the seal of emptiness to the universe, it means, there is nothing in the universe which is not empty. Everything is empty. And because the universe is really great, well, you need a great seal. Well, that's my preferred explanation of Mahāmudrā. Yeah. And then what was the second part of your question? Sorry, can you repeat?
How did you personally come across these teachings? How did you find Mahāmudrā first?
Well, that's a very long story. I don't know whether you want to know all that, but when I was a student, I started to travel to India and I met Tibetan lamas, and I was very much impressed by Kagyu lamas. And so getting teachings from them in a more or less informal way, just special instructions, I came across the term Mahāmudrā first. And then when I was back in Germany, I just kept close relationships to Karma Kagyu centers. So I stayed for quite some time at the Kamalashila Institute in Germany. And there also learned Tibetan, both at the Dharma Center with Tibetan lamas, but also at the University of Bonn, where I became a student of Tibetology and comparative religious science. I took also Indology as a minor. And so I had a dual education, one academic one and one traditional Tibetan one. Yeah, so that's how I got interested in Mahāmudrā. Yeah. And then we had this Mahāmudrā retreat center where the first German group of practitioners went for a 3 retreat. That was also called Mahāmudrā Center, Retreat Center. But I somehow reluctantly didn't join the retreat group because I wanted to continue my studies. So that was how I got started and interested in Mahāmudrā.
Yeah. And originally your research was based on the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga, is that right? Your first?
Well, it was my PhD project. So I edited and translated the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga together with Vasubandhu's commentary. And also the commentary by Jumipam Rinpoche. And that was later published also in Germany with Professor Hans Indica at Tibetica series. Yeah.
Is there a relationship between the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga and Mahāmudrā?
Yeah, sure. Because I think, the Yogacara view of luminous Dharmata or nature of mind, which is empty of duality, the duality of a perceived object and a perceiving subject, resonates well with Mahāmudrā. Except, like that traditional Yogacara, you don't have this kind of immediate access to luminosity, which is somehow available through special teachings, pith instructions, or tantric empowerments, which enable to work with direct perceptions of the true nature of mind. So in this sense, there is a difference between the Yogacara works or the Maitreya works and Mahāmudrā. But you can use, the Maitreya works as a doctrinal foundation for Mahāmudrā. And it has been used also,
Which is a tradition coming from Maitrīpa, right?
Well, Maitrīpa, yeah, that's right. Thanks for bringing that up. Maitrīpa, allegedly rediscovered the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga and the Ratnagotravibhāga, which is the standard Indian treatise on Buddha nature. And the two texts are doctrinally very closely related to each other. Yeah. And then, Maitrīpa passed on special instructions on these two texts and also other Maitreya texts. And later on, in Kashmir, Sachana was explaining this, who received this teaching, this transmission, was also transmitting a meditation tradition or approach to the Maitreya works. And that continued with Tsen Kapoche, who received the teachings from Sachana in Tibet. And the meditation tradition of the Maitreya works is closely related to Mahāmudrā. Yeah, that's right.
And speaking of this Dharmadharmatāvibhāga text and the Ratnagotravibhāga, doctrinally, what is the relationship? Because obviously Buddha nature seems easy to understand how it's connected with Mahāmudrā, but how is the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga expressing it?
Well, we have to say that the term Buddha nature does not appear at all in the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga. But the point of contact is the second chapter of the Gyulama, which is on enlightenment. And that's explained as the fundamental transformation, Ashaya Parivritti, Ne Yoso Churba in Tibetan. And the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga has a huge paragraph on fundamental transformation. The final 2/3 of the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga are based on that. And Lotsawa Zhönnu Pal, he claims that this later 2/3 of the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga is a commentary on the enlightenment chapter of the Ratnagotravibhāga or the Gyulama. So the connection between the two texts is through enlightenment or fundamental transformation. And one has to say that fundamental transformation refers to the result of the transformation. So Buddhahood is equated with fundamental transformation. And it's the Buddha nature somehow, which is freed from the adventitious stains of duality, of ordinary states of mind, which are overpowered by ignorance, hatred, and attachment, that then can blossom, into enlightenment. So it's a kind of dynamic process. Yeah, you already have the potential, for enlightenment, and like seeds, some flowers that can blossom up when you remove the hindrances around it. And this blossoming of Buddha nature, this enlightenment, that is described according to Lotsawa in the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga.
And for a yogi to access this from a more practical perspective, would you say this is where Amanasikāra comes in?
Yeah, now, of course, that's a logical move, like now we like know the fruit, now we know we want to get, now we want to know how do we get it, right? That's very good. Yeah, Amanasikāra, exactly. It's a term Maitrīpa uses a lot. And well, like if you like translate it literally, it means just, non-mentation, yeah, not becoming mentally engaged. Well, try to become mentally non-engaged. Just try to stop thinking. I mean, it makes sense, right? Because according to Madhyamaka, any model of reality, any concept, ultimately is flawed. Like you come up with a very intelligent description of the universe and the human beings, but then like every now and then you find some contradiction, and like every like conceptually constructed model of reality at some point is flawed. So well, the best thing we can do is, well, just get rid of this like models of reality. Just stop creating models of reality. Start like resting, in a state which is free from superimposition and wrong denial. Yeah? Stop reifying. But now, how do you do that? Well, you can try. Just try to stop thinking. How long do you manage to stop thinking? Maybe a few seconds, maybe 10 seconds.
That's engagement.
Yeah, disengagement. How long do you stop? Like I tell you, stop thinking.
That's a new engagement.
And then, why did he tell me to stop thinking? Yeah. So it's a good question. How do you get that? I mean, it's easy to understand emptiness, freedom from mental elaboration, like non-duality. It's something easy to understand intellectually. But then, like, how can such a state be attained, and how can it be sustained? That's the main thing, right? And I mean, there is, of course, like the tantric path, which speeds up the process of accumulation of merit and wisdom. There are like special instructions. They are pointing out the instructions. Like a lama can just, like in a short moment, he can create a situation where you're in a kind of shock, So he says something really strange, and then there's a short gap, like in your thought. And the Lama can point out your true nature, within this short gap. And this way you can have a glimpse, like of this non-duality. And something like that, like, is also happening in a tantric empowerment. So if a tantric empowerment with all the vast empowerments and the secret and the wisdom empowerment and the word empowerment, if that is all done properly, well, you have for a short moment at least a direct connection to the realization of the Lama. Yeah, and then like you work with that. You start cultivating with that. Yeah, and that means like you immediately you start like working from the level of the fruit. Yeah, so of enlightenment, and you identify yourself like with a deity. Yeah, so you after empowerment you are supposed to visualize yourself as Chenrezig or Amitabha, whatever empowerment you got, and you visualize yourself as this deity. The surrounding world, like, is the mandala, is the palace of the deity. All sounds are the mantra of the deity. So in this way, like you identify yourself already with the fruit. And your mind is this non-dual bliss of Mahāmudrā, so to say. So that's one way, like of sustaining Mahāmudrā. Of course, you have to go step by step. You have to go through the creation stage and the completion stage. You have to, even, before you start doing that, you go through Nundro and do the prostrations and all that. And so like there is a gradual path to that. But at least, like you can reach this level within this lifetime, as opposed to traditional Mahayana, where it really takes an eon to reach the first bodhisattva level. on which you have a direct realization of emptiness, or Mahāmudrā. Yeah, so you have the tantric path, and then, well, there are some traditions, they even offer a shortcut on this path, with a direct introduction, like you have it in Dzogchen and in Essence Mahāmudrā. And maybe we should say something. I think, we need to talk about Kongtrul Lodrö Taya's distinction into Essence Mahāmudrā, Tantric Mahāmudrā, and Sūtra Mahāmudrā.
Yes,
Is
please.
this okay?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you're probably familiar with this distinction, right?
I am, but I would love to hear your elaboration on it.
Well, I was studying and translating the introduction to the Gyatsen Gyashom by Karma Tashi Chöpel, who was a disciple of Kongtrul Lodrö Taya at Pelpung Monastery. And he wrote a very nice summary and analysis of the Indian Mahāmudrā works. It's 3 volumes of Indian texts translated into Tibetan and compiled by the 7th Karmapa from the Tenshur. There's one Kanshur text also. And in this introduction, Karma Tashi Chöpel distinguishes Essence, Tantric, and Sūtra Mahāmudrā. Now, Essence Mahāmudrā, he somehow relates to the teaching of Saraha, the dohas. Dohas are songs of realization, spontaneous expressions of his realization. And there, he is very critical of any traditional path. He starts, by in his Doha songs for the people, which has also Indian texts, and which I have edited together with my colleague Peter Santo from the University of Budapest. And we made a wisdom book on that. And in this text, he starts by criticizing non-Buddhist systems. Yeah, he makes a joke out of the Shaivas and the Brahmins, and that's still something normal in Buddhist context. Well, they start criticizing non-Buddhists. Yeah. But then, the text continues to criticize also traditional Buddhists. Yeah, for being too intellectual, or for just becoming a monk to have a livelihood. And so he's very critical. And even about Tantra sometimes, he's critical about Tantra. And so he says, what's the use of all these mantras and tantras? It's just, also the practice of Tsalung, this... Tsalung you could probably best translate as pranayama, working with breathing exercises. And so he says, what's the use of that? It's just disturbing your mind. Yeah, to just relax your mind into sahaja, relax into sahaja, relax into. So what else do you need? And he says, well, either you have the sahaja experience or you don't have it. Yeah. So if you don't have it, you can meditate as much as you want, you will just grope in the dark. Yeah. So what is the use of meditating when you're just walking around like a blind man? But if you have sahaja experience, why to meditate? So you can do whatever you like, you walk around, you always are in this kind of realization of sahaja. So he is very critical of any gradual path. And then, how do you get this kind of sahaja experience? Well, he always says, through the special instructions of the guru, yeah, guru upadesha, yeah, or the special blessings, yeah, of the guru prasad. So that's how, you have to find a Mahāmudrā master, and you just have to open up to him, and you get the blessing. And the idea is somehow that there is a mind-to-mind transmission, so that you just connect with the enlightened mind of the guru, and then you have the sahaja experience. So that would be essence Mahāmudrā. So it's a very direct path, yeah, very immediate. And now, like coming back to Karma Tashi Tripel, he says, well, it's a very direct path, but it is very difficult to practice. Yeah. Well, if you're lucky, you know, like you find a realized master, you get this mind-to-mind transmission and the blessing, and you have this realization. Very, very well. You know, you're lucky. But many are not lucky. So that's why, you know, like according to Karma Tashi Tripel, this essence Mahāmudrā was combined either with Tantra or Sutra. So you can like use the Tantra, the gradual path of the Tantra, to go step by step towards such a Mahāmudrā realization. Or you can also use the sutras, and sutras means also like philosophical texts. It could be, for example, also Madhyamaka texts or something. And so how can you like combine this direct realization of Sahaja with Madhyamaka text? Well, you know, like what comes to my mind, and that was like when I became a student of Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso, and we were receiving teachings, and he was teaching us some really like dry things, you know, like logic, you know, like
Takrik.
Tarik, Lurik, you know, Trugidemic, and things like that, you know. We had to memorize, you know, definitions. What is an entity, you know, like, it performs a function, you know, like, and so on. And then, you know, like, but, you know, the way he was teaching logic and epistemology, and he was so inspiring. Yeah, you could like somehow like feel his realization, and so everybody, you know, like got really inspired by this kind of non-tantric Mahayana teachings, let's call it this way. So when he was teaching emptiness, you know, like based on just like ordinary Madhyamaka texts, you could feel, you know, like that he realized this emptiness, you know, which was described by Nagarjuna or by Chandrakirti, and then, you know, like, and he was like inspiring us. I'm not saying that we also realized it, but like you had this kind of feel for, you know, like, oh, Nagarjuna must have had such a direct experience and such a joyful like glimpse of realization when he was writing these sentences. And so in this way, I think, you know, like this is how, in my opinion, Sūtra Mahāmudrā works, you know. So you use like a non-tantric text, and you teach it in a way, you know, that you directly connect with the content of emptiness or non-duality or whatever it is. Yeah. So that would be like a Sūtra Mahāmudrā. And well, once we like started to talk about Sūtra Mahāmudrā, we should maybe say a bit more about the historical context, isn't it? Or what is your plan? I don't know. Like,
yes, my connected question would be based on this text by the ninth Karmapa, his three Mahāmudrā texts, or Dapotashi Namgyal's, or the third Kanto Rinpoche's. When they present Sūtra Mahāmudrā, they generally have a gradual steps of Ngondro, Shamatha, Vipashyana, 4 yogas, right? When did this happen? Because it seems like early Mahāmudrā, there was no distinction between Shamatha and Vipashyana as such. How would you understand this?
Well, first of all, I would not like say that, you know, this Doluk Chachen was used by the Karmapas. You don't find this terminology. You find it like in Contra Lotratayas, Shecha Rangrig, and you find it in Dapotashi Namgyal, which is much later. And you also find, you know, like justifications of non-tantric or Sūtra Mahāmudrā based on the Maitreya works, for example, by Lotsawa Zhönnu Pal, as a response to Sakya Pandita's critique, who says that like Mahāmudrā is something purely tantric. It's the completions, the result of the completion stage practice. And well, you know, you cannot practice Mahāmudrā without like taking empowerment and going through the creation and the completion stage practice in a traditional like traditional tantric path. So like then there was a response to that by Lotsawa, and what you mentioned, these meditation manuals which start with shamatha and vipassana, that must be definitely seen in this light also, like of taking Mahāmudrā out of its strict formal tantric context. Yeah. But then, like shamatha and vipassana is also different, like when you look at the Chachen Dawe or the other texts, Mahāmudrā texts or manuals which start with shamatha and vipassana. Well, it's a different. The shamatha is different also. Yeah. So normally, like when you speak about shamatha, you concentrate on an object. Yeah. Like on a flame or like a stone, or you concentrate on your breath. That's a very common shamatha practice also. But then, like in Mahāmudrā context, well, you're also using these preliminary like shamatha practices. But the main part of shamatha practice in Mahāmudrā is like to remain one-pointedly in a non-dual luminosity. So you don't get distracted from this non-dual state of your mind, which is a little bit different than ordinary shamatha, I would say. Yeah. And also like vipassana, there are so many different types of vipassana, depending, like whether you're practicing in a Theravada context or in a traditional like non-tantric Mahayana context. But like usually, like in a Mahayana context, vipassana is based on analysis. Yeah, so there is a very nice, like metaphor used by Kamalashila. So if you want to get rid of the wet wood of your concepts, well, you have to start a fire. And in ancient days, when you start a fire, you have to use rubbing sticks, which starts a fire. And this fire consumes all the wood of your concepts, including the rubbing sticks themselves. And then you are in a state free from concepts or like dualistic clinging and conceptually constructed like samsara, if you want. Yeah. And in a similar way, like when you like to get rid of your like all your concepts and thoughts, you have to add extra thoughts, and that's the thoughts of analytic Madhyamaka. And with the help of these analytical tools, you start a wisdom fire which consumes all the concepts, including the Madhyamaka concepts themselves, and then you reach a state free from mental elaboration or Amanasikāra, your non-mentation, which is Mahāmudrā in a way. And then, like Sahajavajra, in his commentary on Maitrīpa's Tattvadashaka, he explains, but here in our Mahāmudrā tradition, we start with direct perceptions of like the luminous nature of mind. Yeah? So we don't need this kind of analysis, initial analysis. We can directly work with direct valid cognitions in vipassana. Yeah, so it's a special type of vipassana. And of course, like you can always, like start with an analysis, but in a typical Mahāmudrā context, you would not overemphasize analysis. You would just, like do an initial analysis if you go at like a traditional path, and then you would like go on to direct perceptions, like of the true nature. Yeah, so like it is like a little bit like, well, John Petit, like whom I recently met, he had written in his book, his PhD thesis on Chumipam Rinpoche, that, like when you come to a new town, like, and you have a new place where you stay, you have a new working place. Okay, first, you study a map. How do I get from A to B? And then, like the second day, again, you look at the map. Maybe on the third day, like you don't need to look at the map anymore, you just drive. And after 2 weeks, you can drive without looking at a map. You can even have a fight with your wife in the car and still like reach B without any problem. So in a similar way, like when you, like first of all, you study and you analyze emptiness and then, but once you understood, like what emptiness is, all the reasonings, well, at some point you don't have to, again, like do all the arguments. I mean, what is the point of going again? Oh, well, there is no arising because there is no arising from self. There is no arising. I mean, they are wonderful reasonings. But once you have understood them, once you have realized it's a valid reasoning, I mean, why to like repeat it again and again and again? Just go on from there. Yeah. So like in a Mahāmudrā context, you would like go very fast, like to direct cognitions. Yeah. Non-conceptual cognitions. Yeah, but like these manuals, of course, they have some initial reasonings. Yeah, but the emphasis is more like direct cognitions.
So these inferential analyses seem to be based also in the combination of Pramāṇa and Madhyamaka. Whereas, would you say that these analysis?
Yeah, thank you for. Well, like it's a good point. Like we are using here the concept of direct cognition, but like you have to understand, like that within Tantra, direct cognitions are a little bit different from the way Dharmakirti defines them. Yeah. I recently studied a text by Yumo Mikyodorje, who was a an early Kalachakra, Tibetan Kalachakra master. He has written the Four Lamps and the lamp like on emptiness. Well, he explains like there, or is it in a commentary on it? Yeah, like I think his son, wrote a commentary on these lamps, and there he explains, like well, he deals with an objection. Well, when you have non-duality, yeah, you have this kind of non-dual realization, and what would be a direct valid cognition then? Because there is no object. Yeah, again, when you define direct valid cognition, you always need like a rangsen, you need a svalakshana, you need a specific object, yeah, which is perceived in a non-conceptual and immediate way, yeah, and non-deluded way. But like he says, well, we do have like direct valid cognitions in Tantra, but when we are doing tantric practice, our like consciousness, our attention is not extroverted, it's not directed to the external world, but it's looking inside to the true nature of mind. And then we realize, or we directly like perceive what is called in Tibetan tongsuk, yeah, which is reflection of emptiness. It's a special Kalachakra term for like a kind of realization which is beyond duality. And when you are completely like non-conceptual, like through tantric practice, you bring all your subtle winds into the central channel, and then you have this kind of manifestations like from emptiness. And but it's not that there is an object and you are a subject. It's just happening beyond, like somewhere like beyond subject and object. Yeah.
Would you equate this tongsuk with the Dharmakirti's yogic direct valid cognition?
No. I just try to explain that it's different.
Okay.
So it's like when you, like the sense faculties, they look inside, and what they see is this tongsuk. They don't see external objects. And the other types also, like they have a direct perception of this tongsuk. And ultimately they are like a yogic direct valid cognition. Yeah. So it's a little bit like when we are talking about this kind of direct perception or direct realization, we are always talking about this yogic direct cognition, which subsumes all the other forms of direct valid cognition, but with a different object. Like the objects are not anymore external, but they are your luminous nature of mind. Yeah.
And that also would be related to this idea of Rangrig, of Swasamvedana?
Yeah, exactly. So Rangrig is also, of course, one of the four direct valid cognitions. And yes, like it's something beyond subject and object. It's like, well, you're familiar with Yogācāra, right? You have the non-conceptual realization of Dharmata. So it's something very similar to that. So, like, there is no subject which is non-conceptual wisdom, and there is no object which is Dharmata. Yeah. So it's simply that, like the wisdom, becomes one, identical with the object. It's like pouring water into water. So there is non-duality. Language is very limited; it cannot really express what that is. But Rangrig or self-awareness would come very close to it. Yeah. So this is a kind of immediate realization. And for example, Sahajavajra, he also says, like this Rangrig, this is luminosity. That's the natural luminosity of mind.
These inferential reasonings, etc., the approach from Kamalashila that you explained on the one hand, versus these using direct cognitions for Vipassana practice, which is the approach taken by Lotsawa. Would you distinguish them on the basis of this Mahāmudrā lineage from Lotsawa, emphasizing more Buddha nature, Yogācāra style practice versus Madhyamaka, Pramāṇa synthesis coming from Kamalashila?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up and also leading our attention to Lotsawa Zhönnu Pal, because I've been working several years on him. I did my book with wisdom on the direct path to the Buddha within. And so, Lotsawa, to start with, he defends somehow or presents, a not specifically tantric Mahāmudrā, on the basis of the Ratnagotravibhāga, on the basis of the Gyulama. Yeah. And he follows the tradition of Trikung Chikten Sumgön, who did the same thing, quoting that our Mahāmudrā text is the Gyulama. So the Gyulama is our Mahāmudrā text, and which clearly anchors Mahāmudrā in a non-tantric tradition based on Buddha nature teachings, and also teachings on enlightenment and so on, and also with a link to other Maitreya works like the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga and so on. So, but then, he didn't, I mean, we don't have any text by Lotsawa where he only describes Mahāmudrā or discusses Mahāmudrā. We are still waiting for the collected works of Lotsawa Zhönnu Pal to come out. We had, of course, the Blue Annals since a long time, and then when I was working for the NGMPP in Nepal in the 90s, I discovered the Gyulama commentary, so I worked on that. And in the meantime, we have 2 more texts on the 3 Dhamma chakras, and discussing provisional and definitive meaning, Buddhist hermeneutics, but we still don't have many texts by Lotsawa.
So we expect more to come out?
Well, I mean, we know they exist, but they are simply not available to us at the moment. Yeah. And so what I can say is that Lotsawa repeatedly, when he defends non-tantric Mahāmudrā, he always quotes Maitrīpa and his disciple Sahajavajra. That's one source. And the other one would be Jnana-kirti's Tattva Avatara. Yeah, and both texts, they are Indian, and the Tattva Dashaka by Maitrīpa exists in Sanskrit, and the commentary by Sahajavajra we don't have only in Tibetan, but in my opinion there is no reason to doubt that it is a genuine commentary which existed in India. And the Tattva-avatara, unfortunately, we only have in Tibetan, but like we have like quotes from the Tattva-avatara in the Subhashita Sangraha, which is an anonymous text. So we have Sanskrit parts from this, like Tattva-avatara. So all that, like is basically material from India. And Lotsawa mainly like refers like to these two sources I just mentioned. Now, like when we look at the commentary by Sahajavajra on the Tattva-avatara, we find some explanations on like directly realizing non-dual luminosity. Yeah, and like he also quotes at some point the Sekanyadesha, another text by Maitrīpa, which is a text on empowerment, and it goes basically like those who don't cling anymore to the remedy or like to the reality or like to experience of realization finds Mahāmudrā. I'm sorry, this is not a literal. I only like describe this verse now like from my memory. It's not a literal translation what I just gave now. But the thing is, like his disciple, like another disciple of Maitrīpa Ramapala, in his commentary, he relates that to the Avikalpa Pravesha Dharani, which is a short formula of how you enter the non-conceptual. Yeah. And it's like supposedly taught by the Buddha, like it's a Dharani, it's like a short sutra. And there, like you have like a passage in the beginning of this Dharani that you abandon, like this conceptually constructed nimittas or signs, like four of them. One is like the ordinary signs of duality, conceptually constructed duality. One is, like a reified form of the remedy. And then, like you have a reified form of emptiness. You like conceptually constructed ideas of emptiness and like a kind of glimpse of realization which shows up. And he like says always, like you have to abandon them like through Amanasikāra. So it's just by withdrawing your attention from them, you abandon them. And like he links, like his like Mahāmudrā understanding with this text, like indirectly, like by quoting the Sekanyadesha, and then like it implies that we have the explanation by Ramapala together with it, and this abandoning of the four nimittas, four sets of nimittas, you find also in the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga. So that's how you get a link, like to the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga. And the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga being like a commentary on the Vyulama, you have like somehow the link like between Mahāmudrā, like Sahajavajra, so Maitrīpa's Mahāmudrā, with the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga and the Vyulama. So that's like how Lotsawa somehow justifies that.
Would this be related to the four yogas also, the ones mentioned in the
Yeah, that's a good
Dharmadharmatāvibhāga?
point. Yeah, like he discusses also like the four yogas, and he claims, that you can find them in the Lankavatara Sutra. So he quotes some parts from the Lankavatara Sutra, which in his opinion correspond to the description of the four Mahāmudrā yogas. And he claims, that there was something like some teachings can be also anchored in the Lankavatara Sutra, which is of course a non-tantric text. Yeah.
And would this also be related to Ratnagotravibhāga Shanti's four yogas?
I think it's closely like Ratnagotravibhāga, if I remember right, it is more related to the like traditional four prayogas in Yogācāra, right? As you find them also in the Lankavatara, but also in the Maitreya works and in the bhavana kramas, you have them also. It's more like you start by realizing that that everything is mind only, and then in the second step you say, well, then there is no external object, and then the number 3, in the absence of an external object, you have no perceiving subject, and then you just go beyond like object, subject, whatever that is, and then yes, Gyamtso also links these traditional 4 prayogas, which you find also in Ratnagotravibhāga Shanti, but he takes it from the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga, the 4 yogas from the Dharmadharmatāvibhāga, and he links them to the 4 Mahāmudrā yogas. Yeah, he does that in his commentary on the enlightenment chapter of the Gülama, of the Ratnagotravibhāga. Yeah, so he sees all these links, between the 4 prayogas in Yogācāra, and also some yogas in the Langavatara. He sees them linked to Mahāmudrā yoga. Yeah.
To me, it seems that not from a doctrinal perspective strictly, but more from a style of practice, Mahāmudrā is so much more related with this Yogācāra Buddha nature style practice versus this analytical approach. Would you agree?
Yeah,
Professor?
good point. Yes and no. I mean, well, first of all, according to Maitrīpa, you can be either a follower of Yogācāra or a follower of a Madhyamaka philosophy and still be a Mahāmudrā practitioner. So practicing Mahāmudrā doesn't necessarily mean that you uphold a Yogācāra position philosophically, or that you subscribe to a Buddha nature theory. So you can be a Mahāmudrā practitioner by upholding a Madhyamaka view. You can follow Chandrakirti and be a Prasangika Madhyamaka and still be a Mahāmudrā practitioner. So the one doesn't automatically imply the other. Yeah. But now what we have in Mahāmudrā, we are not only describing emptiness intellectually. We are not only using arguments, for the negation of independent existence or arising or whatever. But as a Mahāmudrā practitioner, you also have a direct access to this emptiness. Yeah. Well, there is of course no subject. There is no agency which realizes emptiness. So it's an event, beyond subject and object, but it's an event within emptiness, right? And as Trungpa Rinpoche always said, when you have this kind of direct realization of emptiness, you're not in a blank nothingness. You're not in a vacuum. Yeah? But there is this kind of luminosity. Yeah? Or you could also say this great non-dual bliss. Yeah? Just 2 different terms describing the same realization if you want. And now, you would somehow try to communicate that, right? Saraha, he realized that, and he started to sing, he started to sing about his realization. And he's using some terms, and other siddhas, they describe this kind of immediate experience of emptiness, and then the terms from Yogācāra and Buddha nature literature come in quite handy, because they provide experiential terms. So you can use, the concept of the natural luminosity of mind, or primordial awareness, or Buddha nature. But you would not use these terms describing a philosophical position. You would not somehow describe an ontology or something. Yeah, you would not reify these terms. So you would use them only to communicate something which, after all, is inexpressible. Mm-hmm. So you would say, well, this Mahāmudrā experience, you cannot put it in words, but if you really ask me, okay, I can try. well, it's natural luminosity, it's Buddha nature. You can do that. And that reminds me a little bit of a verse in the Lalita Vistara, a text describing the life story of the Buddha. And the Buddha, after his enlightenment, he said, "Oh, I found a wonderful Dharma." Again, I'm not quoting now literally. I don't know this verse exactly by heart. "I found a wonderful Dharma, profound and peaceful and wonderful." Yeah, but I cannot explain it to anybody. I better go to the forest and remain quiet. Yeah. And then, Brahma and Indra, they were seeing the Buddha and they said, "Oh, well, look at this realization, which he radiates, So they have seen, this Buddha, he has really realized something special." And they said, "Please teach, please teach." And then, he says, "Well, it's inexpressible, but I can try." And then he spent the remaining 45 years of his life trying to express what is inexpressible. And that's the beginning of Buddhism. Yeah, he meets different people from all walks of life and he tries to communicate, his realization, according to the understanding and the capacity of the students he meets. And this attempt to communicate what is inexpressible is at the heart of Mahāmudrā teachings. And the terms, the positive terms of the ultimate coming from Yogācāra, Buddha nature literature, are quite handy in that. So in this sense, there is a strong connection with Mahāmudrā and Buddha nature and Yogācāra. But you can be like a hardcore Yogācāra and practice Mahāmudrā. That's fine also. But most siddhas, follow Madhyamaka, this kind of non-abiding Madhyamaka or non-foundational Madhyamaka.
Which is the view upheld by Maitrīpa.
Yes, and he was going against his former teacher Ratnagotravibhāga, who is really hardcore Yogācāra. It couldn't be any more, 100% Yogācāra than Ratnagotravibhāga. She's really we were reading,
Yes.
some parts, and also Rigwell,
commentary.
they're really attacking the Madhyamakas,
Yes.
I mean, that's very unusual, you see. I mean, normally when you don't like philosophical school or a master, you just remain quiet, you ignore him, Not Ratnagotravibhāga, he attacks Chandrakirti directly, So, but Maitrīpa, he went against his teacher Ratnagotravibhāga, but he followed the tantric systems of Ratnagotravibhāga, by the way, yeah, the sequence of the four the four anandas, the four joys, and the four moments, which is very unique also in Indian Tantra. He follows. He didn't break with Ratnagotravibhāga in terms of Tantra, but in terms of philosophy, he broke with Ratnagotravibhāga. And his view, but Maitrīpa somehow, well, he accepts Yogācāra philosophy as a first step. So, well, it's good, to deconstruct the reification of an external world, yeah, and reach mind only, or a state which is beyond subject and object duality. So that's already very good, But then, in the next step, you need to get rid of this reification of non-dual mind or the dependent nature, the ultimate existence of the dependent nature, or the mental factors and all that. You need to get rid of this reification, and you need to realize also that the mind is empty of independent existence in a Madhyamaka fashion. So you go first Yogācāra, and then you refine your view with Madhyamaka. And that is his philosophical view. And you can see that, Yogācāra, first Yogācāra, and then also Madhyamaka, in the way he describes the Tantra. Yeah. So you have the 5 Buddhas, in the mandala. Yeah. And they represent the 5 skandhas and so on. And in the middle you have Akshobhya. You have this kind of later development where Akshobhya has taken the middle of the mandala, and Vairocana has had to go to the east. And then, Akshobhya stands, they speak of a Akshobhya seal, which is, the realization that everything is empty of duality in a Yogacara fashion. So Akshobhya be in the middle means, all the skandhas, they are mind only. And then, you have on top of Akshobhya in his crown sometimes, or just above, Vajrasattva. And the Vajrasattva seal stands for Madhyamaka emptiness. So when you look at the mandala, or at Maitripa's mandala, the meaning of it is that the 5 skandhas are mind only, and this mind only is also empty of independent existence according to Madhyamaka. So that's in a creation, in a completion stage also, there is this kind of level of Yogacara going on to in empowerment and also in the completion stage practice, you have this non-dual bliss, a moment of non-dual bliss, but at the same time you have this non-dual bliss. You need also to realize that this non-dual bliss is empty of independent existence. So the non-dual bliss itself would be Yogacara, right? And then you have to refine that, and then the experience needs to be immediately combined with Madhyamaka emptiness.
This sounds similar to Shantarakshita's Swatantrika Madhyamaka, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, you could somehow also, but it is clear that although he goes first Yogacara and then Madhyamaka, it is clear that he goes further than that, because he's not explaining this kind of combination of Yogacara and Madhyamaka in a way Shantarakshita is doing it as Yogacara Swatantrika Madhyamaka. So he is going further, he distinguishes different Madhyamaka views, and the apratistana or the non-abiding Madhyamaka would be more like prasangika. Not everybody accepts this equation of his apratistana or non-abiding or with prasangika, but some do. Yeah, it's more like prasangika than swatantrika.
Yeah, that was my next question actually. This non-abiding Madhyamaka, then, according to your view, Professor, you would equate it with prasangika rather than swatantrika.
Well, I mean, it's always, what is my personal view? When I study Maitripa, I start to like the guy, and then I feel comfortable with his way of thinking, and so I somehow, for some time, I somehow follow his ideas, but in the end, I keep my critical distance also, and I'm aware, that the other scholars, disagree with his identification of his apratistana with prasangika, but that would be now very technical, and no, it's not directly related to Mahāmudrā also. Well, it is, but I mean, I think there are more interesting topics,
Then moving from late Indian Mahāmudrā to early Mahāmudrā in Tibet, would you mention the contribution, especially from Gampopas, into the Mahāmudrā discourse in Tibet?
Yeah, Gampopa, well, that's of course very important for the Kamakaku school, was an important figure, and he clearly distinguishes a tantric path from a kind of non-tantric path, and he was openly not in the sense of paramita and tantra, but basically he has the Chipaklam, which is the path of inferences. That would be ordinary Mahayana. So the what I explained about Kamalashila, you use like inferences, like analytic reasonings to establish emptiness. So that would be the path of inferences. And then you have the Chinlap Gilam, that's a path of blessing. And that would be the tantric path, like the ordinary tantra. You get empowerment, you start with Nöndro. Well, Nöndro is again a different story, like probably there was no Nöndro at the time of Gampopa. And then, you have the creation stage and then the completion stage. And so you go step by step. It's a traditional tantric path. But then he has also what he calls the Nönsumlam, so the direct path, so the path of direct perceptions. So that would be something separate, like from ordinary Mahayana and the tantric path. So there would be a kind of third path. And now, he was openly teaching also Mahāmudrā to anybody in Tibet, ordinary people, from all walks of life, without giving them empowerments, and they didn't need to do all this complicated rituals and creation stage practices. He was just directly teaching Mahāmudrā, and obviously, he was happy with the idea that they would directly engage with perceptions of their true nature of mind and practice Mahāmudrā as taught without the tantric context. And I think this is what was often criticized, by Sakyapantita, and that you cannot have, this wonderful Mahāmudrā outside, of this gradual tantric path. It's like raisin picking, you just take the raisins and you leave aside, all your commitments. It's like being a bodhisattva without taking the bodhisattva vows, or being just take the fancy thing, and let aside the more difficult steps. So he was criticizing that, and then Sakyapantita, for some in his Domsum Rapye, the distinction of the three levels of vows, the Vinaya, the Pratimoksha for individual liberation, the Bodhisattva vows and the Tantric vows. So in this text, which is a very famous text by Sakyapantita, he criticizes, what he calls present day Mahāmudrā as a kind of Chinese Chan Dzogchen, or Chinese Dzogchen, he calls it, Gyanak Dzogchen. So it's which he meant Chinese Chan Buddhism, but he called it Chinese Dzogchen. It's a kind of Chinese Dzogchen. And but when you look at Indian sources, well, Lotsawa, as I mentioned already earlier, he singled out the text by Jnanakirti, the Tattva-avatara, and the text, it has a explanation for Tantra, for Mahayana, which is non-Tantra, and for Shravaka. Yeah, so there are three big chapters in this text, and first he does explanations of Tantra for those of superior, average, and inferior capacities, and then he starts with non-tantric Mahayana, paramita yana, and then he says, well, non-tantric Mahayana practitioners with superior faculties, they have direct access to Mahāmudrā when they start practicing Vipassana. So they start practicing Shamatha Vipassana with already Mahāmudrā, and that's in the non-tantric part. Mm-hmm. And then the commentary by Sahajavajra on Maitripa's Tattva-dashaka, it has a very explicit passage where he says, well, this Mahāmudrā, which is later it was described as it's paramita naya, it's a paramita teachings based on Madhyamaka teachings, but it accords with Tantra, and later, further down in text, it is called Mahāmudrā. And so this kind of Mahāmudrā, it accords with Tantra. Why? Because you have a similarly direct access to emptiness as if you were practicing Tantra. So in a way, you know, this is kind of elevating your sutra practice to Tantra. So it's an upgrade. So like Sūtra Mahāmudrā is upgraded to business class. It's not downgraded to economy. So it's an upgrade to Tantra, yeah. But it's an outside of this strict regime of creation and completion stage practice. And Sahajavajra clearly states in one passage. He says, so what is the difference, you know, the ordinary tantric path, yeah? And he says, well, this kind of Mahāmudrā, it does not rely on Vajra pride and the sequence of the four seals. Now, Vajra pride means when you are doing creation stage practice, you're proud of being the deity. So you're visualizing yourself as Avalokiteshvara. You need to be proud of it. You need to be convinced, you know, that you are Avalokiteshvara. And then, you know, you are kind of doing the completion stage practice. And then, you know, then you are working with your subtle energies. Technically, you know, you're following a sequence of the four seals here, and the four moments. And that means, you know, that Mahāmudrā is embedded in a sequence of practices and the culmination of the completion stage practice. Now, Sahajavajra says, well, you don't rely on Vajra pride and the sequence of the four seals, yeah, and the moments. So that means, you know, it does not rely on conventional creation and completion stage practice. So you have a clear distinction between a formal tantric Mahāmudrā and the Mahāmudrā, yeah, which is described in this text, you know, in his commentary on the in the Tattvadashaka. And then, you know, the question comes, oh, but then how does it differ from ordinary paramita? And then Sahajavajra, well, it differs because, you know, thanks to the blessing of the guru, you have a direct access to emptiness. You have a direct realization. In this sense, it differs from ordinary paramita. And then he says, but, you know, you have to be very skillful, and it's also a little bit dangerous. It's like when village people grasp a snake, yeah, so you need to know what you're doing. So because if you grasp the snake at the wrong part, it comes back and bites you. So when you work with this direct perceptions of emptiness, you need to know what you are doing. So you need to be skilled like village people grasping a snake. And that's your guru, you know, your lama. He gives you the blessing and the special instructions, you know. He teaches you how to grasp the snake, you know, at the right place. So it's clear, you know, we have in an Indian text a Mahāmudrā path, which is clearly differentiated from traditional tantric path and ordinary paramita path. So Lotsawa, he in his Blue Annals and in his Gyulama commentary, he points out, well, sorry, but Sakyapatita is not right. We have this kind of non-tantric or Sūtra Mahāmudrā in an Indian text. Yeah, so that's the whole discussion. Well, the question, of course, you know, that arises is, did Maitrīpa or Sahajavajra teach non-tantric Mahāmudrā as openly as Gampopa? And well, unfortunately, we don't have a time machine. We cannot travel back, right? But I would rather say no. You know, I would rather say, sorry, but you know, these Indian siddhas, they were tantrics. You know, they were really hardcore tantrics, and so. But anyway, you know, you find kind of some passages, you know, in texts which support to some extent Sūtra Mahāmudrā. And of course, you know, after having been attacked by Sakyapantita, well, after the Yuan dynasty, when other schools other than Sakya were again free to speak, of course, like we're digging around, and looked for Indian sources to show, that there was something like Sūtra Mahāmudrā. Yeah.
So, Professor, I think you have conclusively proved based on your research that there was such a thing as retrospectively called Sūtra Mahāmudrā in India. But can we also say that there was really no influence from Chinese traditions into Gampopa's Mahāmudrā?
I never said there was no influence.
What's your thought on that?
Well, I recently wrote a new paper on the Samya debate, and I also looked at some Dungkwang materials, I think when you look at the situation in the starting from the 7th, 8th, 9th century, I mean, you had of course, Chinese Buddhism, you had the Buddhism in India and the Himalayas, then you had the Buddhism which spread through the Silk Road oasis. And I think there was a lot of interaction between these different areas. And there were a lot of caravans moving, along the Silk Roads. There were business people traveling across the Himalayas to Tibet, or even further to there is one road coming up from the Terai going up to the Mustang Valley, and up in the caves near Mustang, they found some artifacts from Central Asia. So it's clear that there was kind of traffic going on, from Central Asia down to India, and there were a lot of business people traveling also from the Kathmandu Valley to Tibet. And so the thing is, Buddhist monks were often supported by business people. So there was a close relationship between business people and Buddhists. And it's very likely that Buddhists traveled together with these caravans. So together with these trade caravans, Buddhist monks were traveling backward and forward. So that there was a huge degree of interaction, along different Silk Road routes. And I think that there was a mutual influence from China down to India, and India to China, and also to the Silk Roads. And now what happened, at some point, in Tibet, you had Buddhist kings, yeah, and especially the famous Trisong Detsen. He was commissioning, the translation of texts. He supported Buddhists. Now imagine, all of a sudden, oh, did you hear up there in Tibet, there's a rich king, and he's dishing out a lot of funds, to Buddhist people, So it attracts, of course, Buddhist scholars and practitioners, and then, all of a sudden, you had Chan masters, you had Indian different masters, you had Indian siddhas, and there were probably also some masters coming down from the Silk Roads. And I think, there was just a kind of mutual influence. And then, at some point, there was a Samya debate. We don't know whether it really happened, but it's very likely that at some point, all these different groups and players somehow had a final discussion of what is the proper path to be adopted in Tibet. So I think yes, I mean there was Chan Buddhist influence, definitely, yeah. And it's very interesting that texts Mohayan, yeah, the Chinese Chan master Mohayan, yeah, was quoting and using. You find interestingly also, for example, in the Sekanyadesha Panchika by Ramapala. There is one interesting quotation from the Vishesha Viti Brahma Paripricha, a sutra which defines the 6 paramitas in a funny way. Yeah? He says, well, like the perfection of generosity is you give away all your cliches, like, and then like a discipline is like you remain in emptiness in a disciplined way. So it's always like coming back to Amanasikāra and emptiness, all six. And often, like it was said, well, this is not properly Indian Buddhism, and it's maybe something which developed on the Silk Roads or somewhere in China. But now, like there are Indian Sanskrit texts with exactly these definitions of the six paramitas. So, well, either, like you had this kind of Chan elements also naturally in India, or with what is also possible is that, well, Chan Buddhism also spread into India, maybe. Especially in the Mahasiddha milieu, like they were traveling backward and forward, or the herd of them. So, like, I think, like, we should not, as Tibetologists, we should not, like, follow this Samye narrative too much. That, like, you have the pure Indian gradual path, and you have this kind of Subhist and or like enlightenment in one go approach from Chan Buddhism, and which has no Indian roots. And the Chan Buddhists, they lost, the debate, and then Tibet adopted the gradual path. I think we should not follow this narrative so strictly. We should like look at a kind of more complex development of the Dharma. Maybe like work with more modern concepts like cultural transfers. And after all, like this kind of open, dynamic, dependent arising, it applies to the Dharma itself. The transmission of the Dharma, it's also dependent arising. So, like you are a Madhyamaka, you like object any kind of reification and like a kind of notion that things have independent existence. But then you want to reify or like have the notion of an independent Chan, independent gradual path. Like it doesn't make sense. You should apply these Madhyamaka concepts also to the development or the history of Dharma in Asia.
That's a really good point.
Opinion, So yes, I think there are Chan elements in Tibetan Buddhism.
Any last remarks, Professor, you would like to make?
Well, I mean, we use a lot of concepts for something which is non-conceptual, and I hope that all these kind of concepts we were using lead to a practice in which you can have a non-conceptual realization of your wonderful, like luminosity of mind or Buddha nature. So I think that's very important. Like when you study Mahāmudrā, it should always lead to you practicing Mahāmudrā. And that would be wonderful, like if you just take up the practice and find a qualified master and start practicing Mahāmudrā.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. And yes, I guess that's it. Thank you to our listeners, whoever is still awake. And thank you very much, Professor. I really appreciate
You're welcome.
Your expertise.
Okay. So good. There's no question answer also? No.
I mean,
nobody's listening.
I mean,
right?
I asked the question.
It's a podcast.
Yeah, we just talk. There's no audience.
I was curious about because we're taught that like the Buddha did teach tantras, but at the same time, I was curious about like the general consensus on which teachings appeared, and if it appeared in the kind of similar structure.
Well, I mean,
nine yamas.
it's really difficult, to claim, that the historical Buddha, who lived in India 2,500 years ago, taught Tantra. I mean, the tradition basically says that in a supernatural way, he was flying to Udayana and met the king of Ogyen, and the king said, "Sorry, I cannot be a monk. This is not the kind of teaching I can adopt." And then the Buddha said, "Well, for you, I have some special teachings." And then he was teaching Tantra, to the king of it. But then, he was flying in a supernatural way to Udayana, and then he was teaching, in a way that nobody else, could hear. And then, some of the Tantras are also revelations from the Sambhogakaya. So the Dharmakaya is just all-pervading. You have it everywhere at any time. And if you're pure enough, you can have access to the Dharmakaya of the Buddha, and you can have Sambhogakaya manifestations, and from which you can receive tantric teachings at any time, at any place. So the Siddhas, who were realized, they had this kind of access, and then you had transmissions from starting with Tilopa or with the other Siddhas, and then So in a way, it was a transcendent Buddha teaching.
So then how can you refute the Termas?
How can you?
Refute the Termas.
Yeah,
Some
exactly.
people-
Why
some
why should you refute the
Well,
Termas? Exactly.
some people say, "Oh, you can't."
Yeah, sure.
Even some tantric lineages, they say, "Oh, you can't count the Termas," But if it's
I think
the original transmission in the Termas,
you would, this classical materialist view is flawed anyway. Yeah. So when you need to question the materialist point of view, and then you analyze, matter and everything. Well, you end up with a quantum field, right? And there is this kind of waves interacting, and and there is no difference between mind and matter. Both are just manifestations of the same field. So why not having a Terma? It would be just a special structure. It's just a special structure, a piece of information in the quantum field, right? If you are connected, you can retrieve the information. Yeah. So it is something not so implausible. I would say it's with a modern even with a modern scientific point of view, you could easily argue for the possibility of Termas. So if you have a field, a quantum field is often also a field of information, and so you can store information. Yeah. So in biology also they say there are some morphic fields, where shape is stored in a field, information can be stored in a field. So why not having Terma information stored in a field? And that would be the Gongter, right? And then